realize it. Welcome to today's episode of History's Three Sides, episode 3. Obviously, Ben is not in the screen. He won't be joining us today. He's not feeling real well. So I'm going to be flying solo with Will today. Thank you. This is Darren. Today we will be talking about different things concerning credibility and reliability of sources. So I did have a question asked to me offline the other day when somebody asked me, do people really need to know about primary and secondary sources past high school or the college level? My answer to that would be yes and no. Not necessarily, the no would be not necessarily because unless you are actually going to do research papers or submit papers for grade or anything like that, you're probably not necessarily going to need to know what primary and secondary sources are for purposes of legitimately providing support for your argument. Other than that, outside of an academic situation, probably not. But it does help to know what a primary and secondary source is, so you can have an idea, and helping to establish that reliability of information that you're getting from any source that you use, and any debates that you have with people online. For example, I'm always having conversations with people online about the politics right now, about some of the events in history that people are not understanding when it comes to some of the situations with removal of a lot of the monuments that are being removed right now. So understanding history through those primary and secondary sources gives you a better idea of why those monuments were erected and an understanding of why people are so willing to remove those monuments. So, I mean, it does help, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have knowledge of what a primary and secondary source is. So it's a yes and no question. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, please, again, contact me. Let me know if you got a question. I'm always available for listening to questions. So if you are, if you have one, please make sure that you send one to me. You can always send one to me in a private message. You can click on my name, I believe, through History's Three Sides real quick. I'll share my screen so that way you guys can see again the web page that we have, which is History's Three Sides. Anybody can join it. You do not have to be a friend of mine or anybody that is in the History's Three Sides membership already. You can send a request for an invitation directly on the site. Just go to the site, request invite. We'll go through, review what you're about. If you're just somebody that's trying to add another group to your 500 groups that you already belong to, then we're probably not going to add you. But if you're legitimately interested in history and want to know more about history, then obviously we're going to add you and get you in there so we can talk more about history and you can learn about it. So also asked was, what's your intention? What are you wanting to do with this? Well, right now, we're just kind of stuck with the equipment that we got, and the whole thing with coronavirus making a comeback. So as the social distancing is still kind of an issue that we have to deal with. So what we will eventually want to get to is where it's kind of like a videotaped podcast where we all have our headsets on and we're all in the same room talking with microphones, and it's being recorded, and we got our little History's Three Sides logo in the background with some funny props that might apply to what we're talking about for that day. That's eventually the goal, and that goal is down the road, because obviously again with social distancing and the pandemic going on, we kind of want to stay separated for a little while. We also don't necessarily have the equipment or the money for the equipment right now, but that is something that's in the works. So that is where we eventually want to get to, where it's not just me and Ben sitting here talking in front of our computer cameras, and I understand right now it's probably a little bit boring because we're just talking and it's not really a conversation that's taking place, but that's where we want to get to. It might take some time, so bear with us. That's where we want to get to. On to our topic for today. So today we're talking about the credibility of resources, the factual reliability of resources, and the bias of those sources that you can find. A lot of those sources play hand in hand on whether the reliability, credibility, and bias all determine whether your source is a legitimate source for any kind of debate that you're having. One of the problems I run into a lot when I'm talking to have conversation with people, especially about politics these days, all they want to claim this, they want to claim that, and yeah, this, that. Well, what's your source? Where are you getting your information from? And then when I ask them that, it's like this great ordeal for them to provide some kind of source where they actually got their facts from. The problem with that is one side or the other always wants to give not necessarily a non-reliable source because it does report the facts, but there's so much spin to it that the propaganda is so bad that it's either so far left that even Stalin would avoid it, or it's so far right that even Hitler would say, "Ooh, that's kind of rough." So, is that really a credible source? Yes and no. It's credible because, well, it does report the facts, but there's so much bias involved in the way they spin those facts that is it really a source you want to use? And that's kind of the stuff we're going to talk about a little bit today. So, what is a credible source when we're talking about source credibility? So, a credible source is something that you would think of as media. A lot of times, you can definitely find media that is out there that's going to provide you the information you need. In your search for information, you eventually face the challenge of evaluating the resources that you've located and selecting those you judge to be most appropriate for your needs. So you have to examine each information source you locate and assess those sources using certain criteria that you need to use. You need to look at things like how recent that source has been printed. Now, if you're trying to provide a source for something uh, that's more recent, say for example, you want to use a source about who knows, maybe something a historical event, and you pull a source that was printed in 1992. Well, 28 years later, we found more information about that historical event. So that source might have been a credible source in 1993, but here in 2020, not necessarily. It's a little bit too old. We want to look at stuff that's within the past year or two as far as how credible a source is, giving an idea of, okay, so anything that we've found since a certain time is going to be more up to date, which means we've probably found more information about that. Authority. Will, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna unmute Will here. I'm gonna let Will speak to that on what that means, what we talk about when we say authority when it comes to credibility of sources. Go ahead, Will.
Well, authority, credibility of sources refers to who's saying it and what position are they in to say it. Although you may, for example, for an account of the Civil War, have some very good insights from a soldier's diary. Um, Having something by General Ulysses S. Grant where he talked about his plans for a campaign gives you more insight into the larger picture. And he could say, this was my goal upon my appointment, and this is how I followed it up, and these were some of the challenges. So this is credible because he is talking about something he was directly part of. This now a source that might not be so credible might be someone who's just standing on the sidelines commenting with very little evidence. Generally, you're looking for an authoritative source who can provide evidence and insight, and also official documents are good for this. So, for example, a budget plan indicating what the budget priorities were for the 1992 budget. And a statement by the budget director on it would be examples of something that's authoritative and credible. Just someone saying, oh, the budget is out of whack and providing no information. Well, okay, that's someone's opinion. Are they backing up? There's several journalism adages that I used during my decade as a reporter. One was the old, if your mother loves you, so if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Is there evidence for it? Is it authoritative? When in doubt, check out. Can you find facts to back that up? And incredible claims require incredible proof. So if there's an incredible claim, the more authoritative authoritative it is more important. For example, you mentioned a document that was out of date for the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1992. We don't know all the things we knew now. I remember a few years back there was a seminar of some of the figures involved in it. It was revealed at the time, unknown to the public at large, that in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were 20,000 Soviet troops.
Right, right,
Had there been an attack, as some had urged,
right.
some of those soldiers would have been killed, and that would have changed things. Now, the fact that several of the former figures involved stated that was the case makes it authoritative, as opposed to, let's say, just someone who was cleaning a Cuban Missile base.
Right.
It's not as authoritative if the janitor says it, but general who was actually in charge of those 20,000 troops, that's authoritative.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your input on that. So we're going to move on to the third, basically characteristic of source credibility, and that's the audience. Who are you speaking to? So, for example, if I'm speaking to a group, say Mothers Against Drunk Driving, I want to use sources that are going to be useful to that audience in helping to bolster the argument that I'm trying to make with that group. So you want to consider the audience that that source is targeting. So if it's a source, for example, for even today as a political world, say it's a source that is targeting for the re-election of Donald Trump. So that source is going to be, there people are going to be using the source that is going to target audience that would be supporters of Donald Trump, and vice versa. If it was a supporter of Joe Biden, the audience they're trying to appeal to is Joe Biden supporters. So that's another point in credibility for sources. Relevance. How much relevance does it hold towards what you're trying to do? So relevance, meaning, does this article relate to the topic? What connection can be made between the information that is presented and your argument? There's an easy way to check for relevance by reviewing the abstract or summary of an article that you found before downloading the entire article. So you can look at what the summary is of that article to get an idea of the relevance of that article. And then you finally have perspective. Biased sources can be helpful in creating and developing an argument. So, you're looking at, again, the argument for re-election of Trump or the election of Biden. Those sources for both sides are going to be more biased towards what they're trying to bring about. They can be helpful in creating your argument, but make sure you find sources that'll help you understand the other side as well, because a well-developed argument isn't necessarily just an argument that, okay, this is my point. You have to be able to counter the point that your opponent is trying to make. So just because you have sources that back your argument doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you can counter the argument that somebody is making. So you kind of have to have some foresight and look into the argument that you're trying to make, so you have an idea of what argument is going to be against you. That way you can kind of nip it in the bud, hit it before it hits you. So that's pretty much what we're looking at when we look at credibility. Then you have evaluating websites. Websites can create an interesting challenge in evaluating credibility and usefulness, because no two websites are created in the same way. There's all kinds of methods, and we had the method we just talked about, the timeliness, the authority, the audience, relevance, and perspective. That's used quite a bit, but there are additional things that you might want to consider when looking at a website. The look and feel of the website. Does it look hokey? Does it look well put together? The URL, informational resources. You have advocacy resources, business or marketing resources, news, personal web pages. Are there advertisements on the site? Check the links on the page. See if those links lead you to. Do they lead you to something that is going to be more propagandistic, or something that is going to be more factual? Check when the page was last updated. You don't want to look at a page when you're trying to get information, like we'll mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. You don't want to look at a page that was created in, say, 2001 as compared to 2020. We want more up-to-date information because we obviously know more now than we did 19 years ago. So we're going to move on real quick. So one thing I do want to hit real quick is the URL of your sources. So sources like .com, .edu, .gov, .net, .org, they all actually mean something and can help you to evaluate the website. A lot of times .com, .net aren't really as reliable as something .edu, .gov. You know, your .edu, .gov is more factual, based on they're giving you actual reports, as opposed to .com, .net, where you'll see a lot more opinion than you will actual facts on information that you're seeing in those sources like .gov, .edu. So then you have things like useful websites. So useful websites like MediaBiasFactCheck.com. You can go to that website. That gives you an idea on whether a website is biased, how biased it is, what direction it leans. Useful in determining political bias and level of factual reporting. There's a little graph on there that tells you very factual, factual, in between, not so factual. So it gives you a gauge on how factual the source of the website is that you're using. Very useful. I use it all the time. Allsides.com. Although it's not as detailed as MediaFactCheck.com, this site also uses a simple visual to help someone quickly determine political bias with a list of 6 parameters of bias, verification to determine their rating. Despite this site not providing a level of factual reporting, this site does give a history of the sources being checked. So you can always check out, it doesn't necessarily tell you the factual reporting, but you can generally find a link to something that you're trying to get information on and see their background. Factcheck.org. This one actually won the 2019 Sigma Delta Chi Award presented by the Society of Professional Journalists. This site provides a list of recently checked statements made to the media, as well as a place for someone to ask their own question concerning a quote made by the media. So a lot of times when you see fact checks on different social media like Facebook, you'll see a fast check that says false or true or mostly true. That's where it's coming from, is factcheck.org. So a lot of those, when you see a fact check, that's what you're looking at. PolitiFact.com. It provides a scorecard for easy reference using 6 levels of truthfulness with a number of facts checked that fall under each level. In addition, this site provides a link that the user can click on to see how PolitiFact.com determines the truthfulness of a statement and describes the site's guiding principles in determining the truthfulness of statements made on those sites. You have Snopes.com. A lot of people have heard of Snopes. This site provides an area for someone to ask a question about the truthfulness of news articles and reports if they haven't already seen that question. Provides a link that the user can click on to see how the site processes information is for determining truthfulness and other useful information about the site. The site is more difficult to navigate than the previously 2 mentioned, but you can still get around pretty easily. Then you have adfontesmedia.com. This site provides an interactive or even static chart that makes determining where a media source lies on the political spectrum. This chart is updated frequently to keep the information accurate, and I will give you a real quick look at this chart so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about, so you can see very quickly what the bias is for any kind of media source that you're trying to determine whether it is biased or not. So real quick, here is that graphic by Ad Fontes Media. It's their bias chart, and you can see like some of the extreme left. You can see Wonkat, Counterpunch, Alternet. Then you can see some of the extreme right. You'll see things like InfoWars. You'll see I can't even see what that is. Newsmax, the Washington Tribune, things like that. Then you can see the ones that are generally more or less central. ABC, the Weather Channel, You'll see Reuters. It's hard to see in this picture, but you'll see Reuters in here. APR, USA Today. Those are more central. They're not necessarily completely central. You can see they're kind of a little bit to the left, but those are going to be more reliable sources as far as how little biased they are. So those sources are generally not going to be as biased as some of the ones that I mentioned previously. Then we have, real quick, click off of this. After that, I could provide the slideshow that I have for myself that I use information. I can provide that on the website, History's Three Sides, and it has citations of all the sources and sites that I've highlighted here in this, so you can look those up and get the information for those. So you can see that I practice what I preach. If I tell you I'm giving you information, I'm going to give you the sources for that information, so you can see that. Will, do you have any questions? We're getting close to the end of our time here. Do you have any questions real quick?
All right. Let me briefly say that a good question I think we can ask yourself is there evidence backing a claim up? I always considered this when I was a reporter, because if someone claims something, I said, okay, where's the evidence for this? So I think we have to take anything we hear with a grain of salt. There was an old joke that during his heyday, the only person who could go on television and get away with saying there's spaceships outside the UN would have been Walter Cronkite, who during his prime was considered the most credible journalist, and you knew that he would at least be going straight to a live shot with Sam Donaldson or something right next to the UN. So essentially, ask yourself, is it credible? Is there evidence for it? Because anyone can make a claim. It's offering proof that's important. And once you have the evidence, then you can decide which side is right. To use something I posted on the web page, there's a saying, understanding is a three-edged sword. It points at you, at me, and at the truth. And in the end, if we are going to debate an issue, it's important that we have common facts that are proven to be true. We might come to very different conclusions based on our own viewpoints, but if we can say the facts are such, then we can look at problems and say, based on the facts, here's what I propose. And someone might say, well, these are the facts true, but I propose this. This is why candidates prep so much for debates. They try to think of the counter argument, which is stressed as important earlier. And to those who think, why do I need to know this? As I told some of my students, well, if you're going to ask for a new position and pay raise, you better be ready to answer your boss's counter arguments.
Yep. All right, Will, thank you very much for your input. We're going to end our show here in just a minute. Real quick, I want to give another little shout out to our History's Three Sides. So that way, if you want to go to our page and add yourself to get some information on more history, what we're doing with that history, how we can learn more history, we'll go to that History's Three Sides. There you go. Again, just go to the site on Facebook. You can click on request invitation. We'll get that. We see your invitation. We'll check it out, add you, and you can make comments, ask questions, anything you might want to know, requests, any requests you'd like to see. I've already had a couple of requests that we are going to hit in the future. Might not necessarily be right away, but we have definitely had some requests, and we appreciate all your support. We thank you for those that do watch our YouTube videos. We thank you for our 26, or actually, we're up to 31 members on our History's Three Sides now. So we appreciate all those. Every time somebody joins us, we give them a big shout out. So I want to make sure that if you want to do a little bit of conversation about history or learn a little bit about history, this is your opportunity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. Thank you, Will, for being here. I appreciate you joining me and making the commentary that you have. And let's hope that Ben feels a little bit better for next week. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and you have a great 4th of July weekend. Thank you.